Hello everybody, my name's Travis, this is the Daily Travesty, and we are going to continue our look at Flesh and Blood, Jargon, with the types of formats that you can play, and just a very brief introduction to those terms. So when you start looking at Flesh and Blood, you're going to see a whole bunch of acronyms, 2-letter acronyms, 3-letter acronyms, a bunch of different names, and it can be a little bit overwhelming to try and figure out what's going on. So right now, we are going to talk about what some of these mean. Starting with CC. What is CC? CC stands for Classic Constructed. So this is the original constructed format that was designed for this game. It was the only format that they started with besides limited events. And this is still being played quite a bit right now. It's the format that they used for a lot of the national events. Actually, I assume all of the national events use this year. And one of the interesting things about Flesh and Blood is all of the matches are just best of one. There is no best of 3 matches. You play one game. So the game can last up to 50 minutes in Classic Constructed, and you have a massive list of cards that you can use. So unlike Magic, where you have 40% of your deck being taken up by lands, in Flesh and Blood, there are no lands because the cards themselves can be used to get resources. So you have just a ton of actual cards and game pieces to play with. And when you play Classic Constructed, you have to get 80 cards together, which when you're starting out is actually quite difficult to do, I found. When you go to the store, usually what they'll sell you are called Blitz decks. It's a different format, we're going to talk about it, but they're only 40 cards. And if you want to get enough cards to play in a Classic Constructed game, you have to open a ton of packs or buy a bunch of cards to try and get something workable. The first time I played, I had bought a Blitz deck, which we're going to talk about, and like basically a box of packs, and I opened them all, and I was just barely able to scrape together a deck to play in a Classic Constructed event. But it was still fun, and I learned through that. So I can suggest Classic Constructed or the Blitz format that we're going to talk about. What's important to note here is that the 80 card deck list you bring with you to these games isn't necessarily the deck you're going to be using. It's just sort of like your own personal pool of cards you can use. So it's your deck plus your equipment. And after you've seen who your opponent is and what hero they've chosen to use, you do what's called pre-boarding. So because there's no best of 3, it's all best of 1 matches, there's no sideboarding. You don't get to change your deck after you've played someone. That would be silly. So what we have is pre-boarding, where you can decide which cards to put in your deck after you've seen which hero your opponent is going to use, but before you've seen which equipment they're going to use. So you take your 80 card deck list, you pick a minimum of 60 cards to have in a deck, 3 copies max of each kind of card in that deck, and then on top of that, you're choosing which equipment you're going to use. The Classic Constructed format also uses adult heroes. That's something I'm going to be talking about on the next slide here. And the Classic Constructed format is an eternal format. Flesh and Blood, at its heart, is designed to be all eternal. So we don't have rotating sets like Magic, where you play Standard, or the old extended formats and these kinds of things. In Flesh and Blood, basically every card that's ever been printed is a viable inclusion in your deck, assuming that it hasn't been banned. And there have been a couple cards that have been banned already, but for the most part, anything they've printed in the last 2 years, you can take with you to a tournament. All right, Classic Constructed uses adult heroes. There are 2 different versions of most of the heroes, and that includes the adult version and the young version. This is Bravo. This is the hero that I've been using. And they're exactly the same in terms of their ability. Each hero has an ability, and if you wanted to read these, you could. Basically, it's the exact same text on the card. The only difference is the life total. So you'll notice that adult Bravo has 40 starting health, and young Bravo has 20 starting health. When we play Classic Constructed, this is the long version of the game. It's 50 minutes long, and we use the adult heroes, so they have more health. That's the only difference. They have the same ability, they have the same hand size, which is this number in the corner here, intellect. It's how many cards you have in your hand. Other than that, exact same, just a different life total. Now, when you go and you sit down for your Classic Constructed match, you are going to do some pre-boarding. One of the big components of pre-boarding is choosing which equipment you're going to use. So as part of your 80 card deck list, you've included different kinds of equipment. And as an example here, I might be playing Bravo and I see which hero my opponent is using. And then I would have a couple options. I might choose to use a Nothos, which is a two-handed hammer and has an ability. Or I might choose to use a combination of a one-handed hammer called Titan's Fist and a shield called Rampart of the Ram's Head. And I would have to make that choice after seeing my opponent's hero, but before I see which equipment they're going to use. This is part of pre-boarding. So all three of these cards are included in my 80 card list, but I would be choosing one set of them to use for the game. You can also do pre-boarding of the cards in your deck. So as an example, I have two different cards here. They would be included in the list that I made, but after I've seen which hero I'm going to play against, I could choose to take some of them out. Again, we only have to play with a minimum 60 cards in your actual deck, so you might want to take something out. Like, for example, the Staunch Response, this defends for a lot. Again, this isn't a gameplay channel, but this card actually can block quite a lot. It blocks for 5, or if you use its ability, it can block for a total of 8, which is quite a lot from one card. But the way Flesh and Blood works is that when you're being attacked, you block one attack with your cards. So if my opponent was going to play a really fast, aggressive, go wide deck where they're attacking with many, many cards in the same turn, this Staunch Response might not be as good, because if my opponent attacks me for like 1 damage, and then 1 damage, and then 1 damage, then 1 damage, and this blocks 8, that doesn't really matter if I can only block one of those 4 attacks with it. So this is a card that I might choose to take out against that matchup. If I'm playing against an opponent who does one really, really big, massive attack every turn, kind of like Bravo does, then I might want these Staunch Responses. Sigil of Solace, this is just another example of a card that, for one reason or another, you might choose this to be in your deck. This card's probably better in this situation where you're getting attacked for little tiny bits of damage every turn. But this card's good in pretty much any situation, so I think you always play these. That's just another example of the pre-boarding you might do in Classic Constructed. So as a quick review, Classic Constructed, 50-minute games, best of 1. You bring a list of 80 cards, which is all your cards that are going to go into your deck, plus the equipment options you have. Your hero card doesn't count as part of the 80. So I guess that's kind of like your 81st card. And then once you've seen which hero your opponent's playing, you pick 60 cards to go in your deck. You pick your loadout for equipment, and then you go ahead and you play your game. All right, moving on to the next format, which is Blitz. I'd already mentioned this before. This is a newer format. It was developed after Classic Constructed, and basically it's exactly what it says. It's faster games. So 30-minute games instead of 50 minutes. It's still best of 1. All games of Flesh and Blood are best of 1. But the deck composition is actually quite a bit different for these. So unlike Classic Constructed, where you have your 80 card list and then you're pre-boarding cards and equipment and everything, in Blitz, you have exactly 40 cards in your deck and you can't change those cards. So whatever 40 cards you bring with to play with in your deck, that's what you're stuck with. But you can pre-board your equipment. So in Blitz, you have 11 equipment slots, giving you a total list of 51 cards, if you want to think of it that way. And then after you've seen which hero your opponent's playing, you can swap out your equipment, change out your loadout, but the actual deck of cards you're drawing from has to stay the same. And in the Blitz decks, you can only have 2 copies max of each card. So Classic Constructed, we could have 3 of each. In Blitz, you can only have 2 of each. Now, I had mentioned this before, and it might make sense, but for Blitz, we use the young heroes. They are the exact same as the adult heroes, they just have less life. So it's a quicker game, less life. And as a result of that, there are actually some heroes that do much, much better in Blitz than they do in Classic Constructed. And there's some heroes that do better in Classic Constructed than Blitz. And there's some heroes that can be played in both. Bravo is an example of a good starting character for people because the cards in the Classic Constructed deck and the Blitz deck overlap quite a bit, and you can play him in both kinds of decks. But there's some characters that are exclusively used in Blitz, for example. Once again, you can pre-board equipment in Blitz. Example, we could change our loadout from this two-handed hammer to this one-handed hammer plus shield, but the 40 cards in our deck cannot be changed. Here's a quick snapshot of the big differences between the two. Mostly it's the deck composition that's going to change. Obviously the time is less for Blitz. Your life is much less, but how the decks are put together is actually quite a bit different. I think when most people are getting into Flesh and Blood now, they would start with Blitz decks and Blitz events just because they go faster and the decks are smaller. Most of the decks that you would purchase like pre-constructed from a store are Blitz decks. And when you play something like Draft, for example, that's another way people might get into the game. It mimics the Blitz event a lot more. You use young heroes with 20 life and you play 30-minute games. So the Draft games are similar to Blitz. Now, it is worth noting that not all heroes have the same life totals. Most of them have 20 life at the young level for Blitz games and 40 life for Classic Constructed or the adult level. There are some characters that have different life totals, but this is pretty standard, except in a few exceptional cases. One of the nice things that I've discovered recently is this deck building tool online called FabDB, or Flesh and Blood deckbuilder.net. And what I thought I would do is just quickly show you what that looks like and what the decks look like. So this is the website. It's not an official Legend Story Studios product, but it's awesome, and pretty much everybody I know that plays uses this. And what you can do is you can go in here and you can build decks. They have a catalog of every card in the game, and you can come in here and try out different deck ideas. So as an example, this is the Bravo deck I've been playing in the Blitz events. Let's see if this opens up here. And again, you can come in here, you can hover over cards and see all the different cards, how many they are. And this is my Blitz deck. So maximum 2 of each card in the deck, exactly 40 cards for my deck. Okay, no more, no less. And then on top of that, I have up to 11 slots for equipment. So you can see here I have the 2 different kinds of hammers, the two-handed hammer or the one-handed hammer, and then 9 pieces of equipment that I can swap in and out, depending on what the matchup is. As an example, this deck usually runs this kind of footwear, Mage Master boots, but against certain heroes that deal arcane damage, it's just a different kind of damage that not everyone does. I might switch these boots out for Nullrune boots. Okay, they just help me in that matchup a little bit better. So I'm still pre-boarding in Blitz, but it's specifically for equipment. My 40 card deck stays exactly the same. That's different than the Classic Constructed style. So let's go ahead and open this up. This is the Classic Constructed deck. I didn't come up with this deck. I just ripped it off the internet from a deck list. But you'll see it's quite a bit different. So unlike Blitz, where I have a 40 card deck and then 11 equipment slots to play with, here I'm adding up the total number of cards in my deck and the equipment together. So you'll see 73 plus 1 plus 6 is 80. So I have exactly 80 cards. And then when I sit down across the table from my opponent, I see what hero they're playing. And then what I'll do is I'll pre-board. So I'll pick which equipment I want to use. And I might take some of these cards out of my deck. I have to end up with a minimum 60 card deck to play Classic Constructed, but I can have more. There's certain matchups where you end up just playing with all your cards. And there's certain matchups where you take some of them out. One thing I noticed about the pre-boarding and deck design for Classic Constructed is that people tend to try to run pretty lean in the weapons and equipment, because every additional type of weapon or equipment you put into your deck list is one less card you can have for your deck. And you want lots of different options because there's so many different heroes. I think it's better to have more pre-boarding options in your deck and run a very lean equipment list, but that's not always the case. I mean, I think technically you could have 20 equipment and weapons and exactly 60 cards for your deck, but you just wouldn't be able to pre-board anything. So I don't know if that's actually advisable, but I think it's technically possible. So that's FabDB, which is pretty great. All right, we're going to keep moving on. The rest of these formats, they aren't going to take us as long. The bulk of it was looking at Classic, Constructed, and Blitz. So we'll quickly run through the rest of this and these acronyms. Limited is pretty much the same as Magic the Gathering, if you're familiar with that. So they have Sealed, where you don't bring a deck with you. You just go there, you get 6 fresh booster packs. You crack those open. Now you have 90 cards, and you try and build a minimum 30 card deck out of those. That 30, again, it doesn't include your hero, and it doesn't include any equipment. So you have to have 30 cards in a stack that you're drawing from. And the games are 30 minutes, best of 1. And an interesting thing about this game is that the heroes and the basic weapons that you're going to use are all available. The heroes and the weapons are kind of like the deck archetypes that you would build from Magic. So for example, you sit down at a Magic tournament, you draft some cards, or you open your sealed packs and you say, okay, I'm going to be a black-blue deck. Okay. When you sit down at the table for Flesh and Blood, you draft packs or you open your sealed packs, you would say, okay, my archetype is going to be Bravo with a Nothos. Okay, that's the two-handed hammer. This kind of card and this hero are always available to you. They're tokens. They're not cards that you have to draft or open. You're just allowed to have those. The same way that you can go over to the box of basic lands in Magic and take as many swamps as you need. You can always use all the heroes from whatever set it is that you're doing your limited event for. And that's pretty cool. So when you're in sealed to a lesser extent, but when you're drafting, you have to keep in mind, what are the abilities of the heroes? What do their weapons do? Okay, how am I going to build my deck around that? But I think that's pretty exciting. I think it's pretty neat. Draft is basically the exact same as if you know how to draft in Magic. I won't go through how to draft here because there are plenty of other videos about that kind of stuff. But as a quick summary, you have 3 unopened boosters, 8 people at a table, you crack 1 pack open, you look through your cards, you take the one you want, and you pass the rest to the next person in line. And you get a pack passed to you from the person on your right. And you keep going around until you've picked 15 cards. Then you open your next booster pack, you do the same thing. And so by the end of the draft, you've picked 45 cards total. Again, you have to build a minimum 30 card deck, not including your hero equipment. All of the basic heroes and basic weapons are available to you. And you don't have to draft them from your packs. And then you build a deck. Now, one thing that I'm still exploring, because I've only done a couple drafts in Flesh and Blood, is how important is it to settle into an archetype early? Notice that you have to build a minimum 30 card deck with 45 cards. In Magic, you get 45 cards, but you really only have to find 23 for your deck because you're going to put 17 lands into it. So in Flesh and Blood, you end up having to rely on more of the cards you're drafting, which means that if you swim around too much when making your picks, you might be left without enough cards for your deck. And then you have to play these things called cracked baubles. They're basically like resources, but they have no other attack or defensive capabilities. So they're really, really bad. You don't want to put them in your deck. And you're really hoping, never to have to play one. So I think it's kind of interesting. It changes the draft strategy a bit. Whereas in Magic, you might stay more open longer, swim around, maybe not even find your colors until pack 2. I think in Flesh and Blood, you want to be pretty much settled in your hero by the end of pack 1, so that you have enough time to get your 30 cards. Something I'm still exploring. And I'd be interested to hear what your guys' thoughts are on that. All right, that is the Classic Constructed, the Blitz, and the limited events. The rest of these acronyms are basically just set titles. So if you see WTR, ARC, etc., those are the names of the sets that have come out. It's a new game. It's only been out for 2 years. There's only 5 sets that have released. So Welcome to Wraith was the first one, and then they kind of moved down the list from there. Crucible of War isn't a full set. It's not meant to be drafted, or you're not meant to play sealed with it. It was a supplemental set to give extra tools and equipment and cards and stuff to the existing heroes. And the most recent set is Tales of Aria. Now, this is strange to me. These are the set 3-letter acronyms, and they all make sense for the names of the sets, except for Tales of Aria. For some reason, when they put the coding on the cards, Tales of Aria's code is ELE, instead of TOA. Not really sure what is going on there. It makes sense because Tales of Aria is all about these elemental heroes with lightning and earth and ice. So you'll see a lot of elemental cards in that set. So LE kind of makes sense, but it doesn't follow the theme of like WTR, ARC, Crew, Monarch. But anyway, I'm not really sure what's going on there. It's just something to be aware of. Some people in forums and on Discords and in casual conversation will say TOA. Some people will say LE. They're referring to the same thing. It's the Tales of Aria set that has come out. And there you have it. That's a quick review of the formats you're going to see in Flesh and Blood. Again, I highly recommend that you check this game out. Most likely you're going to be playing Blitz. If you sit down with someone and they have a couple of extra decks and they say, hey, do you want to play a game and learn? Most likely they're going to hand you a Blitz deck, or that's probably what you're going to pick up from a store. And it's a lot of fun. If you want to do more of a deep dive into the game and see how it was initially intended to be played, you might be trying to build a classic constructed deck. That's going to be it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. Hope everyone has a nice day. This has been the Daily Travesty. I'll see you later.